If you squinted, you could almost tell yourself you were watching footage from a decade ago. Images of young people crowded into the Maidan Square in central Kyiv. Thousands upon thousands of Ukrainians waving placards, protesting the latest power grab from an increasingly autocratic president. But look closer, and any pretense that these videos were from November of 2013 were quickly dispelled. There was the ubiquitous use of mobile phones, far more common today than in the early 2010s. There was also the lack of heavy police presence, a sharp contrast to the bitter winter days of the Maidan Revolution. What is the same, though, is the sense of anger. The feeling of betrayal, of selling out Ukraine's future. Only this time, the target of the protesters who filled Ukraine's major cities on Tuesday and Wednesday night wasn't former President Yanukovych, but the actions of a man fated throughout the West, Volodymyr Zelensky. Now, if you were an average citizen of Europe and time-traveled to this point from the spring of 2022, such a statement might seem surprising, perhaps even shocking. Since leading Ukraine's resistance to Russia's full-scale invasion, Zelensky has been transformed from a mere man into an icon, a symbol for all democracies threatened by autocracies from Estonia to Taiwan. Even more shocking for our confused European time traveler, though, might be what Zelensky's government has been accused of. As the English-language site Kyiv Independent put in a recent editorial, quoting here, Zelensky just betrayed Ukraine's democracy and everyone fighting for it. Now that's obviously a bold claim, and if you've not been following this story closely, you might wonder whether it's not a little bit over the top. Make no mistake, though, the Kyiv Independent seems to have captured the mood among Ukraine's population. A sour, angry mood brought on by the passage of Draft Law number 1241-4 late on Tuesday night, a law that has led to the first significant demonstrations of the entire war. A law that the government's critics allege would turn Ukraine from a true democracy into something closer to Viktor Orban's Hungary, only with better borscht. The threat of such a power grab has been quietly building for weeks. In a piece on July the 17th that asked whether Ukraine's government was drifting towards authoritarianism, the Financial Times highlighted sanctions levied against Zelensky's political opponents, such as former President Petro Poroshenko, and raids by the security services, better known as the SBU, targeting anti-corruption campaigners. Now, these raids were carried out without court-issued warrants, which would only be legal if the targets were involved in treasonous activity linked to Russia. But while the SBU did accuse some of those it detained of being in the Kremlin's pocket, others were detained for things like traffic violations that dated back years. As the Kyiv Independent dryly noted, quote, the SBU did not go into detail on how traffic accidents are linked to Russia. And then there was the identity of some of those arrested, including prominent Zelensky critic and anti-graft activist Vitaly Shabunin. This was all coming against a backdrop of a government shakeup in mid-July that promoted arch-loyalists and yes-men and apparently came close to unseating the independent-minded spy chief General Budanov, who The Economist described as, quote, one of a dwindling few able to tell the president hard truths. All of this was reported prior to the new law that triggered the mass protests. Yet even these problems were enough for the Financial Times to write that all this had, quote, led to accusations that President Volodymyr Zelensky's government is sliding into authoritarianism, end quote. But it was the passage of Law 1241-4 that really blew up civil society, thanks to Zelensky's apparent willingness to hold a lit match to one of the most explosive issues in Ukraine: corruption. Back in the aftermath of the Maidan Revolution of 2013 to 2014, one of the protesters' biggest wins was the establishment of independent institutions designed to fight corruption. Known as the National Anti-Corruption Bureau, or NABU, and the Specialized Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office, or SAPO, they were able to do what no Ukrainian institution had ever done before: investigate high-ranking people in government without fear of being shut down. You have to understand that post-Soviet Ukraine was a place where accountability wasn't really a thing. A former Ukrainian army officer who posts on X under the name Tartgami points out that, quoting him here, one of the core issues in Ukraine has been the president's appointed loyalists to key institutions like the Prosecutor General's Office, the Ministry of Internal Affairs, and the Security Service. These appointees could bury investigations that were politically inconvenient, end quote. NABU and SAPO eliminated this threat. While there's a lot of grumbling that they didn't function as well as hoped, they have a string of prosecutions of politicians and judges and other powerful people that they can point to show that at least they remained independent. At least they did remain independent until Tuesday. That morning, the Ukrainian parliament rushed through a new bill at light speed. According to journalist Christopher Miller, quote, "The president's office ordered MPs back to the capital for an urgent session on Tuesday, with MPs from Zelensky's ruling faction told that the boss was watching closely and noting any opposition." The bill in question gave the Prosecutor General, himself a presidential appointee, direct oversight of SAPO and the ability to quash investigations launched by NABU. In other words, it would kill the much-vaunted independence of Ukraine's only serious anti-corruption institutions. So, the obvious question you might be thinking at this point is, well, why? Why would Zelensky target two anti-corruption agencies that he once championed? Agencies that the European Union insisted Ukraine set up as a condition for one day joining the bloc? Well, the answer depends on who you believe, to be honest. The authorities' version is that NABU and SAPO had both been harboring Kremlin spies. According to the SBU, one of NABU's head detectives, Ruslan Mahmedrusalov, was linked to both the Russian government and a drug syndicate operating out of the Russian Republic of Dagestan. Others at the agencies were accused of working with disgraced Ukrainian politicians known to be in Moscow's pocket. Now, to be clear, no one has access to the evidence the SBU is using. So we wouldn't want to dismiss the idea that Moscow has managed to infiltrate two agencies with broad leeway to investigate members of the government. The flip side is that Russian spies have previously been uncovered in other agencies, including the SBU, without the government reacting by shutting them down. As the heads of the anti-corruption group Otto Maiden noted, Russian moles could work at any government agency, but it is not a valid reason for destroying the NABU as an institution. Now, a more obvious reason might be that highlighted by the government's opponents. NABU claims it has just started investigating close Zelensky allies like former Deputy Prime Minister Alexei Chernyshov and a relative of one of the president's old friends from his TV producer days. SAPO was also said to be looking into members of Zelensky's inner circle. The accusation, then, is that Zelensky is trampling Ukraine's institutions to save his friends, institutions built on the bodies of the protesters who were killed on the Maidan in 2014. Or, as the arrested anti-corruption activist Vitaly Shabunin told the Times of London, "After these events, I feel like Ukraine is no longer a full-fledged democracy. It feels more like a hybrid regime, still democratic, but with elements of authoritarianism and kleptocracy." End quote. And this is what triggered such a public backlash on Tuesday and Wednesday nights. What triggered, as we said, the first mass protests since the start of the war. Remember, Zelensky was elected in 2019, at least partly on his message of victory over corruption. To see the self-styled servant of the people become instead the servant of his corrupt friends, well, you can imagine how that might piss people off. And, well, piss them off it absolutely did. Kiev, Lviv, and Dnipro all saw vast protests, with both ordinary people and soldiers taking part. Chants such as "Ukraine is not Russia" were heard at rallies, while others simply held signs saying "F*** corruption." Interestingly, at least from an outside perspective, the protests didn't directly target Zelensky. Instead, chants seemed to focus on the head of the presidential office, Andriy Yermak. Although, as someone on social media pointed out, this seems to smack of the old trope of good Tsar, bad advisor, when all evidence points to Zelensky himself favoring a new bill. What the protests weren't, though, and here we have to be super clear, were calls for striking a dirty peace deal with Russia. If you get your news exclusively from Wingnuts, you might have seen people like US House Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene claiming on Twitter that these protests were an outpouring of public desire to surrender to Russia and strike a peace deal that would favor Moscow. To dispel any lingering doubt, such an interpretation is only possible if A, you are a deeply cynical Kremlin shill, and B, you have no one you can talk to who is actually Ukrainian and currently in the country. Thankfully, WarFronts is better resourced than certain members of Congress, apparently, because, well, we had a reporter on the ground for the Tuesday protest in Kyiv. And while she emphasized the anger people are feeling, she also noted that people are aware Russia will try to use this situation for its own ends. And we'll quote her. "This moment plays straight into the hands of Russian propaganda and Ukraine skeptics alike, those eager to cast doubt on the legitimacy of our authorities or to question whether Ukraine is a democracy worth backing. And Russia will use it to push the narrative that standing with us is pointless." This is something those Ukrainians in the street know in their bones, yet they're still willing to go out there and fight because they're so utterly disgusted with this bill. Or to quote our reporter again, people are furious, to put it mildly. And the public response was immediate and spontaneous. You could see thousands flooding the streets all across Ukraine. The protests were driven by ordinary people, not coordinated by political parties or prominent figures. Now, beyond sheer disgust at the president amassing power and licensing corruption, there were also worries about the knock-on effects that this bill could have. Establishing NABU and SAPO was a critical step on Ukraine's long and tortuous path toward membership of the European Union. Ending their independence puts the country's European future at risk. Indeed, the EU's Enlargement Commissioner, Marta Koss, wrote on X, seriously concerned over today's vote in the Rada, their dismantling of key safeguards protecting NABU's independence is a serious step back. Now, although there are many dimensions to the direction Ukrainian history has taken over the last decade and a half, one of the constants has been a desire among people to pull closer to Europe. It was Yanukovych vetoing an association agreement with the EU that triggered the original Maidan protests back in 2013. So, for Zelensky to imperil Kyiv's European trajectory was almost guaranteed to cause a reaction. Not that this was the only thing he imperiled. Republican Senator Lindsey Graham, a staunch Ukraine supporter, pointed out what an own goal the bill was, saying, "One of the most widely used talking points for ending support for Ukraine is that it was awash with corruption." Now, of course, things like this bill, they do not happen in a vacuum, and there are reasons to believe that the nation's Western partners may have indirectly encouraged Zelensky in his power grab. On the American side, the return of Donald Trump to the White House has coincided with the US losing all interest in encouraging Ukraine to pursue reform. On the European side, there has been a tendency to equate Zelensky with the country he leads and refrain from criticizing him in case it helps Russia. The point, though, is that Ukraine is not Russia, a country where a single man's word really is the law. Ukraine's democracy is far, far bigger than just its current president, and it now appears that Zelensky is being forced to learn this the hard way. Already the mass protests have forced Zelensky to backpedal. On July the 24th, Ukraine's leader declared that he would submit a bill to the parliament restoring the two agencies' independence. According to the Kyiv Independent, quote, "In a statement following its review of the new draft law, NABU and the legislation would restore all procedural powers and guarantees of independence for both NABU and SAPO," end quote. With the Rada currently in recess, it should be impossible to vote on this bill until late August. But as this video went into production, there were rumblings that an emergency session will be called next week to quickly rush a vote through. Ukraine, it seems, has stepped back from the brink. Still, this entire episode raises serious questions about Zelensky's judgment. For no sensible reason, Ukraine's president triggered a massive political crisis just at a moment when future international support is in question and Russia is grinding forwards on the battlefield. Even if you consider Zelensky a hero, there's no getting around the fact that this was a supremely stupid thing to do. At best, it was an indefensible attempt to counter possible Russian spying by destroying the independence of two agencies. At worst, it was an attempt to exert autocratic control over a democratic nation to make Ukraine into a cut-price Hungary. Luckily, though, Ukraine isn't Hungary, or Russia, or any other state utterly defined by its thin-skinned strongman leader. For evidence, just look what happened this past week. When ordinary people in Russia tried to protest during wartime, they are hauled off the street by heavily armed goons, beaten and sentenced to years in prison. In Ukraine, by contrast, this week's protests were peaceful and lightly policed. As Kira Rudik of the political party Golos wrote on X, quote, "Protests in Ukraine, even during the wartime, prove one thing. We are a true democracy. This is something Russia will never be able to dream of." And the thing is, she ain't wrong. Occasionally, we get inordinately angry people criticizing our Ukraine war coverage, claiming that we're biased in favor of Ukraine. To which we can only say, are you stupid? Of course we want Ukraine to win. Of course we want this war to end with Russian soldiers crossing back over the internationally recognized border and Putin falling out of a window after shooting himself twice in the back of the head. We're not ashamed of wanting that. But believing Ukraine has the right to keep existing as a free and democratic state does not mean that we are mindless stands for Zelensky and his government. People across the world support Ukraine precisely because it is bigger than a single man, precisely because it is the sort of society where people are not afraid to come out on the streets and express their anger over a moronic power grab. And look, we get it. In this day and age, especially, it's tempting to tie an entire nation to the single man leading it, to take the words of Trump to speak for all Americans, or the words of Putin to somehow communicate what's in the soul of every single Russian. But the entire point of living in a democracy, the thing that makes our societies strong, is our fundamental right to look at the guy in charge, laugh, and say, dude, you're being a bit of a tit. Well, that's what happened this week in Ukraine. Tens of thousands of people standing in the streets, unafraid of how the images of nightly protests might be manipulated by pro-Russian grifters, unafraid of a government that tells them they're undermining national unity in wartime. Tens of thousands of people exercising their God-given right to tell Zelensky that he's being a tit. Or to quote our reporter in Ukraine, one final time today, this is a reminder that Ukrainians, even 11 years after the Revolution of Dignity and in a war against Russia, are ready and will fight for our values, whether on the front line or on the streets. All the implications that will follow after this law will hurt. First and foremost, not Zelensky or other top authorities. They will fall on the very people who have carried this country through war and crisis, especially those serving on the front lines. But as in 2013 to 2014, Ukrainians understand what's at stake and will not back down. End quote. In allowing this absurd law to be passed, even if it will now be undone, Zelensky has permanently damaged his image on the world stage, perhaps even hurt the cause of Ukraine in its fight against Russia. But he's also shown us all that Ukraine is still united, still a democracy, still a country worth supporting, a country that has always been, and will always be, bigger than a single man. Thank you for watching.